doesn't exist until it cracks apart. Time doesn't exist until it cracks apart. Time doesn't exist until it cracks apart. You were pretty at night. Time doesn't exist until it cracks apart. You were pretty at night. Slew the white-haired one first. You were pretty at night. Slew the white-haired one first.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's Time to Rewind, the podcast trapped in its own time loop right along with the movies we discuss. This season is the serial Bomb Yo, and we're looking at Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel, and we've moved on to looking at a few additional episodes from the series. Today we're discussing Angel Season 5, Episode 14, Smile Time, probably best known as the puppet episode. And so I brought on a puppet expert as well as a Forgotten Films expert, Todd Liebenow. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me. Glad to be on the show.
Yeah, and I'm glad to have you back on. It's been a little while since talking about Groundhog Day here.
Yeah. Well, I was on the first one for that. So yeah, it has been a while.
Yeah. But I am very curious before we jump into this episode, because you're the second guest here that is brand new to Buffy and Angel. I had just before this I talked to Jason Soto about the pilot episode of Angel, and now I brought you on to discuss probably the one of the best episodes, or one of the favorite episodes of this series, and I think even though it does have a couple bits that are very important to the end of the season, like for stuff that comes later, I think it's mostly a standalone episode. And I am curious, like, what you thought about Angel with Smile Time as your jumping on point.
Yeah, well, I have seen some of Buffy. I will say that. Mainly like the first season I watched a bit of, but I'm just not a big TV viewer. I watch, I sit down with a movie every night. So a lot of these shows from this time frame are not ones that I kept up with. And I've never seen Angel before. I knew a little bit about it. I mean, maybe some character names, and that's about it. And it was clear watching it that there were some elements here that I'm going, okay, I'm sure if I knew a little bit more about who these characters are and what their dynamic with each other is. I mean, there's a lot of things in this episode about, like,
relationships.
Yeah, and
it's almost got like a romantic comedy, like three romantic comedy subplots going on at the same time.
Yeah, and it all seems to be cases where, like, one person clearly has the hots for the other one, and the other one is clueless about it. So, that's the kind of stuff where I just kind of rolled with it and was like, okay, I'll just, I'm sure that all gets resolved at some point. As usual, I'm just here for the puppets.
Yeah, kind of going into a little bit of the relationships. We have Nina and Angel. And Nina is a brand new, like, recurring character for this final season. She's a werewolf, obviously, which we don't get to see the full werewolf, but we do get to see the werewolf arm, which I thought that was a fun way.
Is that something that, like, is hidden throughout the season? Like, have we only seen an arm at this point, or are they slowly reveal bits and pieces of the actual werewolf here, like the shark in Jaws or something like that?
It's at this point, it's been a little while since I rewatched season 5, like a few months. I watched them. I think I went through it back in October and November. So it's been a few months, but I'm pretty sure. I mean, the episode that Nina is introduced as a character is a werewolf episode, and I believe we actually see her as a werewolf first before we see her as her human character.
Sure.
And she's, introduced as a brand new werewolf that had just gotten attacked by, the werewolf that scratched her.
Mm-hmm.
And so she has the episode where they, break it to her that she's now a werewolf and will be a werewolf for the rest of her life. And then she pops up in, like, just, one or two other episodes and she's just kind of this minor character that's kind of slowly building a relationship. And after this, I think she's only in one more episode before the series ends.
Mm. Well, I get why, they maybe decided to not show full werewolf in this episode. All they show is, like you said, an arm. And, you gotta spend a bunch of budget money this time around to build puppets and hire puppeteers and things like that. So all you get is a werewolf arm in this episode. We have to save some money somewhere.
Yeah. And then we have the Fred, Knox, and Wesley love triangle, kind of, where, Knox has had a crush on Fred for quite a while. And I think Wesley has had like a bit of a crush on her. Like he's kind of started to develop feelings for her, and Fred has been the same way. And that's been building for several episodes.
Okay.
And so we get to see the result of this. And like most Joss Whedon properties, as soon as the characters get happy, something happens. And just like 2 episodes later, or possibly even in the next episode, which completely ruins that, and Fred turns into basically this demonic character that completely changes her character for the rest of the series.
Oh, and you don't have to worry about spoiling things for me. Well, for one thing, it's like, what, 20-some years old?
Yeah. Yeah, and like the other thing that's very important is, Gunn, basically the lawyer in this episode. He was originally just kind of a street thug, and then in this season they gave him this magical surgical implant that made him super smart. And they talked about all the doctor with the flowers for Algernon references.
The doctor was creepy. I was like, okay, clearly this is an ongoing villainous character or something like that, because like that's too bizarre of a portrayal for just one throwaway scene.
Yeah, I think he had a couple previous appearances in this season. And also, I am curious, like, what's your take on, like, from watching this episode specifically, what feeling did you get of Wolfram and Hart, this company that they're working for?
Well, it seemed interesting. I mean, it took me a little while to kind of get the basics of what it was all about. I mean, because, coming into the episode, you just kind of see there's these people in this office, and some of them look kind of unique. Okay, I was kind of like, okay, looks like a Men in Blackish type of an organization, something like that. So, it seemed like it was something that is, somewhat under the surface, secretive and that. But at the same time, I guess I was a little confused as to how much this world is aware of this organization, these people, because there's the one guy that, with the horns and the green skin and whatnot. And I mean, just no one bats an eye. And he talks about how he knows all these producers in Hollywood and things like that. And I'm like, okay, just a normal thing in Hollywood, I guess, in this world anyway. I don't know.
Yeah, what Wolfram and Hart is basically, the secret but not so secret, basically like evil / demonic lawyer company, law firm. And they end up, the Angel group, the good guys end up running the LA branch at the beginning of the 5th season, which is, it's hard to explain, so I won't, but, it makes for, a really interesting direction that they did in this 5th season, where they really go in a weird direction, but I think it works for the show, and it really opens up the world of Angel and allows them to do a lot of weird things like this episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, even just, this being the only one that I've ever watched, it still felt like this is really a thinking outside the box type of episode. I mean, it's really going beyond, whatever bizarreness they have, in the rest of the series. This is really thinking outside the box for sure.
Yeah, and I do love how they how they really like almost hang a hat on it, where you have multiple characters like Harmony, Spike, and Fred. Their first reactions to seeing Angel as a puppet, it's like, oh, you're so cute.
It's funny because I've experienced that type of reaction to things before. You kind of hinted at it at the beginning, but I have worked professionally as a puppeteer throughout my life. I've been a puppeteer. Ever since I was a kid. I had an interest from a very early age, and there are times when I have used puppets in situations where folks are not necessarily used to that type of thing. I remember when I was in college and I was in a class where it was a video production class, and the thing we were doing the whole semester was producing this news magazine type of a program. And when the instructor found out that I was a puppeteer, he roped me into being one of the co-hosts of the program as a puppet. And there was this girl who was brought in to be the human co-host. And it was just funny, her reactions when she, kind of had to process that she was going to be doing these segments with a puppet. And, she would catch herself like, I remember one time when she was just so embarrassed because she was talking about the next scene that we had to shoot and she's talking and looking at the puppet in the eye and talking back and forth with the puppet, and I'm crouched behind the wall and I'm just performing along and saying and just talking with her as the puppet. And about 2 minutes into the conversation, she hangs her head and starts laughing and goes, I just realized that I'm talking to the puppet and not talking to the person. And so you have those weird moments where it just kind of catches people off guard as they realize what they're dealing with.
Yeah, and I read through the trivia for this episode, and some of the cast members said that happened in this episode too, for the puppeteer controlling the Angel puppet. In between takes, he would continue to puppeteer Angel and talk to the cast and crew as Puppet Angel.
Well, yeah, part of it is just staying in character, that type of thing, but also, I have found personally, like it's hard to relax the body. I mean, puppetry is, yes, there's a lot of skill and performance to it, but it's also a lot about just your strength and keeping your body and your arm in an odd position and things like that. And a lot of times if you break in shooting something, you don't want to bring your arm down and rest and stuff because you're kind of in that performance mode. So a lot of puppeteers, myself included, we'll keep the puppet up. We keep, moving and reacting to things like that. And just, continue to exist as the puppet, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So what did you think about the puppet designs and the puppeteering and as it's presented in this episode? Because I definitely noticed a couple really interesting moments for sure. Like there is a couple moments where we see Angel like walking down the hall unassisted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That moment was kind of interesting. It was clearly done as a marionette, and they probably removed the wires, digitally or something along those lines. It was kind of funny as a puppeteer to watch that because marionettes are notorious for kind of having this walking style where the knees don't really move or move in a strange way. And that's the way that Angel is walking when we see him full bodied walking there. So that was kind of, I think a funny little inside joke, a puppeteer joke kind of. But no, the puppets are great. They're definitely very much in the Muppet style. I don't think these were actually built by the Henson Company. I tried to do some looking, but I mean, a lot of what we know today as hand puppets, or at least the moving mouth style of hand puppets, is very much based on what Jim Henson and his organization did. So even folks that aren't a part of the Muppet organization, the things they're producing are very much inspired by that, and this definitely is.
It wasn't officially the Jim Henson Company that did the puppets, but they did bring in several Jim Henson alumnus.
Yes, yes. Um, and I mean, the performance is very well done. Um, the angel puppet specifically has a great challenge to it because um, they would have had to have been lip syncing either live or with a recording of somebody else. The actor that plays Angel, of course, is not the puppeteer playing
Mm.
Angel. And so, that can be more of a challenge sometimes than if you're delivering the voice yourself and lip syncing with your own voice as you perform as a puppeteer. So that certainly was a challenging aspect of the performance. And also, I was talking to my wife about this morning. One of the things that did impress me watching this was that the puppeteers are having to do some awkward things when it comes to their body position and what they need to do to get into the scene, because many of the sets for this episode are the same sets, I assume, that they're using
Mm.
throughout the series, which means they weren't constructed with puppets in mind. Sets that are built for puppets are built in a way where things are raised up. There's a floor that's missing in certain spots, so that the puppets can be at one level and the human actors can be at another level. Things like that. I mean, that's the stuff where if you look at the behind the scenes of Sesame Street, The Muppet Show, things like that, you'll see how that all works. But when you have stuff going on with puppets in these law offices and stuff, I mean, those sets, I'm assuming they weren't going to rebuild those sets to make them work better for puppeteers. So the puppeteers are having to crouch under tables and desks and when you see them walking down the hallway, not the full bodied puppet, but you just see the half waist up puppet walking down the hall, I
Mm.
assume the puppeteers are laying on their backs being pushed around on carts. That's often the way they do that. And that stuff is difficult.
Yeah, I imagine that's, I think one of the more famous, shots from this episode is the slow motion hero walk with Puppet
Yes.
Angel holding the sword behind his head.
Yeah, yeah, and that was a cool shot. And I would imagine, probably there was, somebody that's just behind the camera pulling a cart that has the puppeteer on it, lying on his back, making that puppet walk through the scene. Um, they're definitely employing a lot of the same tricks that you see out of the Muppet stable, and not just in terms of the performance, but also the way that different shots are pulled up. If you watch closely, you'll see it's fun to watch the edits when you're watching puppetry because you know certain puppets can't pick up things, certain puppets can't move in certain ways, but they'll do different tricks with the editing and things like that to make you think that you saw the puppet do these things. Um, so, like in most of the shots, the puppet version of Angel is what we would refer to as like a human arm style puppet, which means that you have a puppeteer with their hand in the head and then one hand in one of Angel's hands, and then there's a second puppeteer controlling the other hand. So they're the puppet's hands are actually gloves, and this way the puppet is able to pick things up and handle things and stuff like that. But then in other shots, like what you mentioned there, where they're walking down the hall and Angel's holding the sword over his back and such, I mean, the arms would have been stuffed most likely and affixed to the sword. There's no puppeteer manipulating the hands at that point because they don't have to move. So they do all these different tricks to, change the puppet around or change something in the shot so they can pull off something. And that's Jim Henson pioneered that kind of stuff. So yeah, those
Mm.
those are those Muppet tricks.
All right, so I think we've talked about the puppets themselves enough. Let's get into the actual story of the episode. Like, what did you think about this story of this basically, these demon puppets that take over this kids show and you know basically like release Joker venom and as they talk to which I love that they really called that out with when
Yes.
Knox is like maybe it's the Joker.
The first thing that went through my mind, because you have that kind of prologue to the episode, and the kid puts his hands up to the TV, and then the mom finds him on the floor. And, of course, the first thing, though, that I'm thinking is like, oh, my gosh, are we going to kill kids in this episode? Oh, no, they're not killed. They're just in this weird state, whatever. But, yeah, when they showed the face, I was like, it's the Joker. It's right out of 1989's Batman. It's Smilex or whatever that stuff was. And, so, yeah, I was glad that they actually referenced that and said, yeah, we realized that we're kind of stealing that a little bit. I also wondered, I haven't seen this new movie Smile that's out yet, but I wondered how many similarities there were with that too, because I keep seeing images from that with the kind of frozen smile on people's faces. But anyway, no, the story is clever. I mean, I thought it's almost like this, I don't know, this bizarre concept that I think some people have of just like children's entertainment, when you think about, is this really of the devil or something like that?
They had to make a deal with the devil to make something so, childish and silly become so popular.
Yeah. Well, and I guess part of the thing with that for me was that I wouldn't have necessarily picked a Sesame Street style thing to portray that, because to me, I granted, I'm a little biased, because I love all things puppetry and grew up on Sesame Street. But I mean, Sesame Street is a program that's not just made for kids. It's made for the adults that watch it along with the kids. It's very clever. It has a lot of humor that kids are never going to get, but is fun for the adults. If you want to ask me something that's more demonic, send me to like Barney or something like that, But
yeah, I am actually curious that I know that there's a documentary that recently came out that takes a look at the Barney phenomenon and kind of questions why, this beloved children's character became this touch point as, so many people just despised this character.
I am so glad that Barney was kind of on its way out by the time I had kids that were in that age group to watch that. So we never really had to deal with that in my house. There's interesting elements to this that I think you can pull from other, examples of fantasy and horror that you see. I mean, the idea of something kind of sinister coming through the TV screen, things like that. You've seen that, in everything from Poltergeist to Videodrome, so it's pulling elements from other things like that. I got a real kick out of the sequence, which is actually, I think, the most horrific sequence of the whole thing, where you have the guy that created this program. I assume they're modeling him off of Jim Henson.
Yeah, Gregor Framkin.
Right.
And he was played by David Fury, who is one of the producers. And I think it's funny because one of the other miscellaneous episodes that I covered was the musical episode Once More with Feeling. And that's another episode where David Fury has a small but memorable appearance where he has, basically a one-line musical moment where he sings, about them getting the mustard out of his shirt. With a full dance accompaniment behind him.
When he showed up in there, first of all, just from the look of him, being this somewhat jovial type of guy with a beard and all that, I thought, clearly they're trying to model him off of Jim Henson there. And to me, as a puppeteer and someone who has worked a lot with puppet builders, I don't claim to be a puppet builder myself. My efforts in that area are not great. But I work with a lot of very talented people who could build some fantastic puppets. And so when they show him sitting there and he's got a glue gun in his hand and he's working on things, I was just like, oh, that's perfect, because the glue gun is like the tool that never leaves your side as a puppet builder. That's like always there. We've always during our puppet programs that I was involved in, we'd always have a glue gun backstage, plugged in, ready to go, because if something needed repair quickly, the glue gun is the way to do it. And so that was just perfect that he had the glue gun. But then you had the moment where that lead demonic puppet is sticking his hand in his back and operating him like a puppet. Which, first is kind of like, ugh, he's got his hand in his back there. But it's funny because it made me think of not a hand puppet like this, but a ventriloquist dummy, because a ventriloquist dummy is more like what they're portraying in that scene, where you've got a opening in the back of the puppet as opposed to in the bottom of the puppet. And there's actually usually a rod or a stick inside the puppet's body, which attaches to the head, and there's little levers and stuff that are being operated to control the mouth, the eyes, whatever. And so just that scene made me think more of a ventriloquist figure than a hand puppet.
Yeah, and you can almost think that, somehow he's controlling him through his spinal cord.
Exactly. That's exactly what was going through my mind. But yeah, it's I did appreciate that moment for being something that is a bit more dark and sinister in what is for the most part a fairly playful episode. I mean, they try to go dark a bit with the puppets at times, but still,
I think there's just
playful.
a small handful of really dark moments like that one, and just the idea of the kids and the Joker grin, and I think the first moment with which I believe it was supposed to be Gregor Framkin with the towel over his head, even though we never actually see who it is.
I wondered about that because when I was thinking through the episode after watching it, I was like, now who was the guy with the towel over his head? When they first show him sitting there and he's got the towel draped over, I was like, looks like the Rancor Keeper from Return of the Jedi.
Yeah, I'm just guessing that it's him just based on the body type, because he is kind of a larger guy.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's hard to say for sure because we never see his face and he's never really referenced again. But
Right.
I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think that was supposed to be Gregor.
Yeah. Well, and I kind of wondered, what happened to the actual puppeteers, because they don't really reference that in the show, but this is a show that's been going on. This other guy created it. Clearly there have been other puppeteers. In fact, in one of the scenes, you can see pictures on the wall in the studio backstage area that show puppeteers operating the puppets. And so I was like, all right, well, what did they do with the actual puppeteers?
No, I imagine they're either, the zombie people walking around, or maybe they were sacrificed to the nest egg.
That reminds me of another thing, and this is just something I was picking up on as a puppeteer. When they show the zombie people that are, operating the camera and they're doing all the technical stuff there, there's a guy there holding a boom mic. No, that doesn't work in the world of puppets.
Yeah, because everybody is, down below.
Yes, and with puppets, we if we're doing our own voices live, we wear headset microphones because that way, no matter where your head turns, that doesn't the microphone is not affected. The microphone stays in the same position in front of your face, regardless of how you move your head.
Although I think it would actually work in this instance because the voices would be coming out of the puppets' mouths,
right,
and not from the puppeteers.
Yes. But seeing that at first, I was like, you never see a boom mic on a puppet set.
And I do love some of the puppet characters. I mean, I think that the guy and the girl are very generic puppet characters, but I love Groovus the dog. I love his character and how he's the other two are more focused on this plot to steal children's innocent souls. And then Groofus is the one focused on, but I have a really great song that I want to have for the episode. This is our last one, so I want to make it a good one.
Groofus is a little more of the crazy character. He reminded me a little bit of like a Gonzo or a Grover, in terms of the dynamic with the
even though his
puppets.
voice is very Ralph.
It's a bit Rolf. It's a bit, when I first heard it, I thought, is that Kevin Clash? Kevin Clash is the guy that did Elmo,
Mm-hmm.
and he did various other characters. And when I first heard Rufus's voice, it sounded a lot like there's a character on Sesame Street that was called Hoots the Owl. He was this jazz playing owl character, and Kevin Clash
Oh
performed
yeah.
that. It was actually the same voice. You and I are of a similar generation. I don't know if you remember this, but before he was on Sesame Street, Kevin Clash was on a show called The Great Space Coaster, and he did a character called Goriddle the Gorilla, and it's basically the same voice. And when I heard that Goofus voice, I thought, that sounds like Kevin Clash, but it's not. But yeah, no, the one that I thought was just really funny is the one that is almost borderline to be able to really call it a puppet, because it's more of a costume, and that's the
Ratio Hornblower.
yes, Ratio Hornblower. And I think part of what I liked about that was that I have always had a great affection for puppet characters that speak in their own language, that speak a gibberish or something that, somehow the other characters are able to understand, but we're not able to understand.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a character like the Swedish Chef or Beaker or Animal even. They don't really speak a language that all the rest of us are understanding, but the other characters somehow understand it. And that's the case with this character, or it just has this honking sound. I love that technique. I love how Goofus and the others have conversations with him as if they perfectly understand what all that honking means. I mean, and that's something that, you see in other things too. It's like, it's the same concept of how, like, Han Solo can understand what Chewbacca is saying,
Mm-hmm.
So that's always something that I have used that before with puppet characters. Well, I have like one character who's a monster and he just talks in a gibberish language. And then the other character, oh yeah, you're totally right about that. So yeah, it's a fun technique that is, goes way back in the art of puppetry. So it was great to see
Mm-hmm.
that here.
Yeah, and I loved his demise too, because it's so violent, but it's still in this puppet world. Whatever Fred shoots him, and then Wesley rips his horn out, and then you have the pieces of fluff flying out of the hole where his horn used to be.
The fluff bothered me a little bit. I realize, what they're doing there. I mean, that's the puppet equivalent of gore in this
Mm-hmm.
episode. But again, as somebody that works with puppets, I'm going, actually, there's not that much stuffing involved. Most puppets are going to be made primarily of foam and fleece. You don't actually stuff, that much with like that type of stuffing. So like when you see at the very end, I think, is it the girl character that's like lying there and there's just stuffing everywhere?
Yeah,
Like,
Nina.
yeah. And I was just like, there's never that much stuffing inside a puppet. Maybe a little bit here and there, but not that much.
Yeah, and I was actually a little bit surprised by yeah, by that moment of like almost salaciousness, because she is this nude character, that's nude woman that's just kind of covering herself up, even though she's only on screen for just a few brief moments. But I
Mm-hmm.
feel like that's not a direction that Angel as a show goes in all that often.
Well, and I gotta say there, that scene where you see her waking up and she's got no clothes on, I was kind of like, oh my gosh, they really, I wonder how many times they had to reshoot that, because they have, her arm is very strategically placed. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I want to that I have to mention, that we haven't touched on at all, because he's a fan favorite character, and it is just one of the best moments, is the fight between Puppet Angel and Spike.
Yeah, I mean, I'm coming into this again not knowing much, but I've definitely heard, the name Spike, and know that this is a fan favorite character and all that. So, I'm sure this was, a moment where they got to just kind of go wild a bit there. And it's the type of scene that that plays into a gimmick that's used a lot of times, where you have something that's small and cute, beating up on someone that's much larger. I mean, that's half the gimmick of like a movie like Gremlins, for example, when you see a small gremlin creature attacking an actual person and the legs are flopping around and all that stuff. I mean, it's the same kind of gimmick that we're seeing here.
Yeah, and I think it fits in with their character dynamic, because the Angel and Spike in this season are very much frenemies. They tolerate each other, but there are, very, they annoy each other greatly, but they're kind of reluctantly work with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I guess you could say the puppet ends up winning that battle, so that's good too.
Yeah, I think that's funny, and I also love, they kind of briefly mention it, but the fact that Angel being turned into a puppet also gives him proportional emotional, like he has,
Yeah.
puppet highs and puppet lows, because, puppet characters do typically have these exaggerated emotions. They're either, very, extremely happy, or, they run the extremes of the motions for the
Yeah.
most part.
Well, no, that's totally something that when I have been involved in, teaching other performers, instructing other performers, especially with developing characters, we always talk about how you can't just approach a puppet character as yourself. If I was to do a puppet and it talked the way I talked and it act the way I act, that's not interesting. You've got to either heighten it or bring it down a bit. A puppet is either much more excitable or a bit more dour, so you can't just go live in reality. You have to go to an extreme a bit more with a puppet.
Yeah, I think there's very few instances where that type of, direction works, and, it's not exactly a puppet, but I almost think if this were a live action show, it would be a puppet, but like, in Family Guy, the character of Brian,
Mm-hmm.
he is actually, he is a normal character that has normal emotions for the most part. Other than the occasional gag where, he does dog things, but he is a dog, but in all other aspects, he acts like a normal character with
Mm-hmm.
normal, with standard level emotions and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting you bring up animation there too, because puppetry really is kind of a
It's almost like
more.
live action animation.
Exactly. It is. It's a more fleshed out version of animation. It has limitations that animation does not. Like we talked about, how you usually only seeing the puppet from the waist up and things like that. There's certain things that puppets can't do, but it's got a lot of similarities to the world of animation for sure.
Yeah, and I think that pretty much covers this episode. And I'm not sure if I caught it, but, what are your overall thoughts on the episode? And is it enough to make you like want to watch more of Angel, or you do think, that this is enough? I
Well,
I got it from here.
this is definitely the one for me to watch if there's any episode. I mean, this is the one. I mean, I was intrigued. I was definitely interested, to find out more about the world, and I could see myself maybe, catching up with a few others. I mean, you mentioned there's a musical episode, and I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. But like I said, I tend to spend most of my time watching movies. It's hard for me to get into episode television these days, just because it's just not the world where my mind is existing. So I can't say that I would never sit down and watch more Angel. I probably would round out my Buffy viewing more first, just because I know that's kind of the bigger pop culture icon. But I was intrigued by what I saw here, so this was interesting. I do want to throw out one thing from a puppetry standpoint that we didn't get to, and maybe part of this is just the way my eyes are trained to be watching for this. But there are two scenes in this where I spotted the puppeteers. I spotted their heads. So if you go back and watch, the scene where Angel is first back at the offices and his co-workers are seeing him as a puppet for the first time, and then they all start to leave the office and he stops them and he says, hey, keep this quiet, I don't want anybody knowing about this. He's sitting at a desk or a table or something, and if you look down in the bottom left corner of the shot, just under the edge of the table, you can see the puppeteer's hair. And there's another very brief moment where you can see the puppeteer's head. I think it was the puppeteer operating the lead demon puppet, right as the big climactic fight is happening in the TV studio at the end. I caught a brief glimpse of the puppet's head. But I mean, like I said, my eyes are kind of trained to look for that, because when I've been involved in puppet video productions, if you're not on the set performing, you're watching the monitors going, and like if you see a head, we would shout head and we'd stop and we'd start again. So
now I would say for a show that's not used to filming puppets, just 2 brief hair shots is not that bad.
Yes, no, I mean, believe me, there are early episodes of the Muppet Show where, if you are quick on the draw, you can spot a actual puppeteer's face speaking between the puppet characters and things like that. So, yeah, it happens. Sometimes there's no time to go back and shoot it again.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining me today and giving Angel a shot to talk about with this episode. And for anybody else that hasn't heard you before, why don't you go ahead and take a minute to let them know where else they can find you online?
Absolutely. So, well, thank you. First of all, this was a lot of fun. And like I said, always glad to talk about puppets. But my blog is called Forgotten Films. That's at forgottenfilmcast.wordpress.com. We talk about the movies that nobody else talks about over there, the ones that have kind of vanished from the radar and that. I have a podcast that goes right along with that that's called the Forgotten Filmcast, where on each episode I'm joined by another movie blogger or podcaster to talk about a forgotten film. Bubba has been on the show several times. I think the last time he was on, we talked about Robot Carnival, which is an animated film. Hopefully we'll have him back on the show again real soon there. So yeah, check out all my stuff. And I'm on Twitter at Forgotten Films. That's films with a Z.
And as always, I am Bubbawheat, and you can find me on Twitter where I'm at Bubbawheat. You can find this show, It's Time to Rewind, on Anchor.fm, as well as anywhere else that you listen to podcasts. We have a Facebook group, It's Time to Rewind, a time loop group. You can join that and discuss episodes as they come out, as well as have discussions about time loop movies or TV shows in general, and also be updated about what's going on in future seasons of this show. And after this, we will be looking at the series finale of Angel before going all the way back to the beginning and discussing the original Buffy the Vampire Slayer movie. So until next time, grrr.
Arg.
Time doesn't exist until it cracks apart. Time doesn't exist until it cracks apart. Time doesn't exist until you were pretty at night. Time doesn't exist until you were pretty at night. Slew the white-haired one first. You were pretty at night. Slew the white-haired one first.